So we are being, this way your colleagues who aren't here now will be able to see all the stuff you see later. And you'll have a memory of our time together. So best behavior from here on out, because there is a recording. That goes mainly for Jess and no one else. So here's what I was thinking we would do if this works for y'all, is I have a draft of outlines for tiers 1, 2, and 3. And I figure we would go in order, kind of go through the content kind of briefly. I'll show you some of the, the additional handouts and other pieces related to each of the tiers, and we can sort of talk through stuff. I'm happy to take conversation edits here. Also happy, I will upload all of this to the Dropbox, and you all will have time to more digest and send if you want, bigger edits, changes, etc. You all now, once I put it in Dropbox, I will put a PDF copy and a PowerPoint copy, and that way you can also make edits on your own. If there's smaller edits you want to make, you all own this, so you all can make whatever edits you want. But if you're like, oh, we want to overhaul this whole section, can you give us another option? That's when you would come back to me, or, well, me, because Jess is doing the other side of this, and we would make some of those changes. Does that sound good to y'all? Okay. So I'm going to do a screen share here for tier 1. So, couple things as we get started, and you all can feel free to interject at any time, to interrupt if you have questions, comments, something you want to say. I borrowed the PowerPoint template that was Mount Union's background from your other presentations. I know that you all had a separate one that you used before for GSA Q&A. I think it's fine to use either one. I do think that there's a little bit of power in branding this for Mount Union and making it feel like it's a part of campus, which is why I utilized your colors and your scheme. For tiers 1 and 2, I really took the content you all had, which was really good, and just sort of made it, expanded it a little bit, added some pieces. Each of the tiers comes with a PowerPoint deck, handouts, and then a facilitator guide that walks through sort of talking points, bullet points for facilitators. So in the 2 videos that we looked at for tiers 1 and 2, one of them you had a PowerPoint, one of them you didn't. I think that if you're going to have multiple presenters, having a component like a PowerPoint can be helpful, because then you've got similar talking points as you go, right? The other thing I will say from my experience as we talk about tier 1 is you all give a lot of credit to your audience, which you all know your students and your faculty and staff colleagues better than I do. But as someone who's done this for 20 years now, you'd be surprised how many people still don't know what the word lesbian means and have never understood what transgender meant in their life. So we broke stuff down a little bit more in tier 1 here, just to give some real world examples. The examples are the easiest things to change and update, by the way, because you all can use folks on campus if you want, or you can use more up-to-date pop culture references than what I've put in here. Any questions so far before we dive into what GSA Q&A tier 1 looks like? Okay. Last note is that originally you all said you want each of these to be an hour. Technically, they could be an hour. It would be a tight hour if you did each of these in just an hour. My recommendation would be to see if you could carve out 90 minutes for each, but I understand that can be impossible. With that said, you may need to, after you do this once or twice, see if you want to cut some activities in order for it to better fit in the hour, or, like I said, look for more time in order to do all the activities that we run through, okay? So tier 1 starts off, still use your beautiful ground rules graphic here. I updated your ground rules. I'll show you that after we get through this presentation. It's one of the handouts. That would be part of the pre-work you would send that you all have already been doing ahead of time. And then you ask people for any questions, additions, any concerns that they've got with the ground rules. Then the icebreakers, sharing our stories. So I utilized the Trevor Project Stars activity. You all had used a modified version of this. And so I went back and used some of the Trevor Project pieces more specifically. And this is an adapted version that I've used a couple times in places for audiences that don't know each other. I would say if you're looking to trim something, this is the easiest thing to trim because it is an icebreaker. But the idea is someone would put in information about themselves, right? Their close friend, a family friend they would turn to advice, a community they belong to, a job you would like the most, a future goal or dream. And then they would go around and meet other people in the room. And they'd introduce themselves, they'd share their name and their pronoun, they get to know each other, but they can't talk about anything that's on the sides of the star. So the idea with this is that they're trying to imagine what it would be like to be in the closet as an LGBTQ person, someone who is unable to share about their life with people that are around them because they're unsure of how they're going to be treated. There's a little bit of debrief that comes with this icebreaker. And then we would jump into the beautiful, wonderful gender unicorn that you all have. I think this is a great tool, but again, I think that it's a little bit complex for folks. And so giving people examples can be helpful, right? So for example, you want to break this down and talk about gender identity. What does that mean? Internal understanding of who we are in relation to gender. What is a gender expression? What is sex assigned at birth? Physical attraction and emotional attraction or emotional attraction, right? So I think breaking these down again can be really helpful for folks. The gender unicorn also breaks down physical and emotional attraction separately, which is something that even folks in the community don't always necessarily do. So you may want to spend a little extra time on those pieces. And lastly, everyone has all of these, with the exception of assigned at birth. Only you can know who you truly are. So the sex assigned at birth is something that happens to you. The rest of these are not. All of this is explained in the facilitator guide. There also is, I've developed a blank handout version of this that you would give to the participants. And as they're going along, they have the option to complete their own gender unicorn. Part of this is getting them to see themselves in the conversation. A lot of times heterosexual cisgender folks don't understand that they have a sexual orientation or that they have a gender identity or a gender expression and that this stuff impacts them too, right? So getting them to start getting in that framework as developing allies is helpful, okay? So then it's helpful, again, to give them examples of people, right? So to look at the unicorn and to draw out some ideas of people like celebrities who are out publicly about who they are, like Ellen, right? And talk about some of the labels that we use when talking to someone, talking about someone, or what someone might use to define themselves, right? So I put in here Ellen DeGeneres, Billy Porter, Laverne Cox, Elliot Page, Sam Smith. And the last one people may not know as well, but Mauree Turner is one of the first out non-binary people to be elected to public office. They were elected in Oklahoma's 88th district, which is in part Oklahoma City, and they just came into office in 2020 in that big wave that we saw. And so they are a good example, I think, of someone who's out publicly, but not a celebrity in the sort of Hollywood realm, because it can be helpful to give some of those examples too. Obviously, there are plenty out LGBTQ people that you could put that aren't celebrities in this other examples, right? That you might want to use. But again, these are the easiest things to change. You would just put in a new celebrity. And again, you want to put in sort of what we know about them, what they've shared publicly about their identities. Everybody with me so far? If we use this, we need to make sure you're using sources for the imagery. Yes, we can totally add that. I will tell you all of these images come from Google free open source images. So that is how I access them. Any other stuff so far with folks? Okay. So this here is just about, there's too many boxes. This is just about the other labels, right? So here in the spheres, these are the colors that the gender unicorn uses when talking about identity. And these are the terms that some people use to define themselves. Now, you all wouldn't go over all these terms. All of these are found in the glossary that would already be available. You already have a great glossary from actually Jess's program from I Am Safe Zone that talks about all of these. So they're already defined for them. but it gets them to start understanding that while we're talking about one community, there are these different categories of identity, right? The other piece to drive home, in my opinion, with labels is to let people just remind them that their labels are personal, right? And subjective and important. An individual defines who they are for themselves, but we also put labels on others and we assume labels, and labels can also give us a community. So it's not my role to tell someone else who they are, but it is my role to, if they do share who they are, try to understand what that means and how I can be supportive of them, right? And then this is a model of multiple dimensions of identity, which I think is a good one. I added this to your content here, just talking about identity at the intersections. Obviously, LGBTQ people aren't just our sexual orientation and gender identity. And this again talks about the different parts of who we are and how they interact and intersect just as a visual, right? And then again, you would invite them to do their own. This is what the handout looks like, minus the boxes that you see in the little cutout, right? They're not going to share this with someone else. This is for them. And they also don't have to complete it in the training if they don't feel comfortable, or if they want to do one as a practice, they can do one in the training and take one home. It would also be available in the pre-work that they could take with them afterwards, right? So any questions or comments about that initial activity from folks? Okay. Do a little check-in here. This is where people would have a chance to ask questions. Oh, Sarah, did you have something that you wanted to add?
I was just going to say, I feel like I liked it. I mean, I think a lot of that is content we tried to cover, but I think having some definitive examples with different arrows and that kind of thing, and breaking out the separate parts of the gender unicorn would help me as a facilitator. So I appreciate it. I'm a fan so far.
And I should back up and say, you know, when I watched y'all do the presentation, you talked about all of this. It just wasn't necessarily spelled out in this way. Right. And so really all I've done is try to spell it out for folks so that they have it visually in front of them. They're hearing you say it. They're hearing you talk about it. But yes, absolutely. Tiers 1 and 2 are going to be pretty much a reminder of what you all have already been doing. All right. Well, check-in time, how folks doing, right? Because you're going to go into your STARS activity. And this is where you would use the, I recommend using the Trevor Project STAR activity as an empathy builder, right? This is, you know, if you all have done the Trevor Project's version of this activity before, it can be difficult for folks because it is talking about disconnecting from family and, you know, community. And so I would recommend that as you do this, you have a facilitator who is talking through the pieces of the activity, and you have a facilitator that I call the vibe checker, right? Who's watching the room, saying how the participants are doing, is able to check in on a participant if they're having trouble, if they're visually upset, if they need to step out of the room, et cetera, right? So I did put a care warning in here. This is especially can be emotional for folks who are part of the LGBTQ community or folks who have had issues with family, friends, et cetera, right? So this just runs through, and I pulled the PDF copy of the full activity for you. So this will be in the facilitator notes. But basically you have folks have different color stars, and depending on what color star they are is what happens to the different pieces of their star, right? And so that's the close friends, family member, et cetera. And so you would go through each one, and based on the color star that person has, it tells them what to do, what happened in their story, and then whether or not they need to fold back a part of the star, or even if they need to tear off a piece of the star, right? And so you would go through this for each of the pieces of the star, the close friends, the family member, the community that you're a part of, the job that you want, and your future dream or goal, right? And then you have a chance to debrief. And these are the debrief questions that come with the activity. And then I added one about bringing it home to Mount Union. Yes, Sarah, sorry.
That's okay. So from the icebreaker, we did this, I mean, they're going to use their same star So that part is the star is already done. So that's very clever. Good job. And this is just tiny, but Mount Union never abbreviates Mount as MT.
Ah, good to know. That is not tiny. That's a big deal.
Just as an aside. I mean, there are people who do, but they're wrong.
But they are wrong. Absolutely. I apologize for being wrong, and I will fix that before I upload it to the Dropbox.
Totally fine.
Oh, Adelina, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, can you go back to the stars part again? Just back 1 or 2 slides, like. So, okay, that's fine. So these stars, the color stars, I must have missed this part. How do students get assigned a star? Because that's the thing, right? Like we're randomly assigning these stars to them. Is that how it's working, or?
Yes, so they would randomly get a color. They would either be on the desk or the table before the presentation started. You'd hand them out when they're coming in. They can pick a color when they come in. There's no information on the stars of what the colors mean until you get to this activity later on.
Okay. And so does that sort of presuppose that they have the same reaction across all 5 of these areas in the star, or would they, because potentially you could have a different color for each of these areas, right? Like friends and family.
They have the same color for each prong, is that the right word I'm looking for? Each arm of the star. So let me back up again.
Sorry, I missed, I apologize.
No apologies needed. So each of the prongs, arms of the star, each is labeled 1 through 5 with the name of their close friend. So like I would put like Jess as my close friend. I'd put my mom as my family member. Community I belong to would be, I'm on the soccer team. Job I would like most, I want Sarah's job. I don't know. I don't really want your job, Sarah, no offense. And then future goal or dream, I really want Kelly's job. I don't know, right? Whatever it is. And so they get just one color star, and then they run through each of the activities. And so on that first upper arm, if they have a blue star, this is what happens in their story. They've come out and this is what happens. And then if they have a purple or orange, they would fold back a piece of that star. And if they had a red star, they would actually tear off that arm, meaning that they have disconnected from that person. Does that help?
Yeah, and this is one of the empathy activities. I don't know, we had 3 or 4 different ones and people could choose. So this is one that was one of our options. And it's pretty impactful, I feel like. I remember doing it at some point in history, and and having your star be kind of mangled at the end, and what support is left and what support is not left. It was very impactful for me, and I feel like has been for other people when I've presented.
And it's hard to tell the whole piece now because you don't see the full story. All you're seeing here is what happens to each of those stars. That's what's on the PowerPoint. But again, you have the facilitator guide from the Trevor Project, and I've also spelled that out in the facilitator guide I've written for y'all so that you can see this more clearly. Now, this is one of those activities where ideally you would be reading it and have the pause in talking so that people can take the full brunt of what you're discussing. That obviously takes more time, right? Because I have seen facilitators go through this activity in a total of 5 minutes, which you can do, but it doesn't have the same emotional impact if you're going really fast because of time, right? And then this is a piece I've added to this. I've seen people use this before. I did not make this up, full disclosure. But you would have Scotch tape available. So people that had to rip off parts of their star would have the opportunity to mend that relationship if they chose to, right? And what we're talking about here is about building up community, and the tape is representative of that community. Sometimes community can help us rebuild those connections we've lost. Sometimes they're building new connections to help us deal with the connections that we've lost, right? And so this is talking about what's going to make a difference in our community, awareness education, which is this first tier, active allyship, which is the second tier, and then advocates and accomplices to shift culture in the third tier, right? So this is where you would put your beautiful, fully spelled out Mount Union sticker, right? And this is where we talk about right, we have 3 tiers, although these last 2, advocate and accomplice, are both in tier 3. This is tier 1, this is tier 2. And this just gives folks a little bit of a review of what they've done, right? So you've raised your awareness, gained some understanding of key concepts. We've started some allyship work by building empathy for others, right? Tier 2 is going to focus on building more allyship, skills building around interrupting homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. And tier 3 is going to focus on making our community more equitable for everyone, right? So again, this is just, the last slide is really just for folks to say, like, this is what we've done together in our time. Here's what's coming. We hope you'll join us for tiers 2 and tier 3. If they have the option. If they don't, you would just start the next tier. And so I'll show you what the facilitator guide looks like now. If I can get computer to cooperate, here we go. So this is what your facilitator guide looks like for right now, right? So it has the information on what you would need to bring in terms of your checklist, what supplies you need, and then what are the pre-work and resources that are here. And then you have talking points for each of the slides and a rough outline of how many minutes to spend on them. Again, this is not, everybody has a different facilitator style. Some people just go with the flow. They don't need these talking points. They've got it down. Other folks really like having this, so that's why I've created it. Don't feel like you need to use it if it's not your style. But this just includes some additional questions, comments you might put in. Again, some of you are going to have your own examples or stories that you can add to the conversation, right? And there's also some notes in here like, hey, there's a terminology check-in. You may not have time for that. You might want to keep moving along, right? And this goes again through the full Trevor project. Stuff is copied and pasted here, but I'll also include that in the Dropbox. So. And there's also, if there was any data that was shared in the comments, there's links to where that data comes from, because I did put in some statistics in this one. Any other thoughts on tier 1? Initial thoughts, I should say. I got a thumbs up from Patience. Thank you, Patience. All right. And I got a thank you from, where did I get the thank you from Madalena. Thank you. All right. So tier 2. Tier 2 is really, the slides aren't going to be very helpful, so I'm going to go through them quickly, and then I'll show you the facilitator guide. Tier 2, again, ground rules, quick review. These are the activities that we did in the first one. It wouldn't necessarily be going over them again, just trying to get them to jog their memory. Oh yeah, I remember the unicorn. Oh, I remember the stars, right? And then this is adapted from a colleague of Jess and mine, Shane Wally, who talks about support on a spectrum instead of just you're an ally or you're not, right? And so talks about the spectrum of hater to tolerant to acceptance, then to ally, to advocate, and accomplice, right? And so all of this is outlined in the facilitator guide, but it's a little bit of a misnomer because it doesn't actually always just flow left to right. It's not as if someone just magically evolves into being an ally, right? This is about our behavior. So sometimes you exhibit ally behavior and sometimes you only exhibit tolerant behavior based on the day, based on the circumstance, based on what's happening in that moment, right? But this is I found to be a helpful model for people to think about allyship as an active thing that they're doing, not as something they either are or aren't, right? And allows people to recognize, hey, I may not be an ally yet. I might just be, hopefully not in the hater, but I might be in the tolerant or acceptance. And then I need to figure out what internal work I need to do to get to this purple section, right?
I love this part.
Oh, good. And so this is where you all had you have the implicit bias test. This is the pre-work that would come with tier 2. You all already had the questions in here. So this is just a debrief, right? So I recommend doing this as a pair and share because it can be hard to talk about your bias in the big group. It can also be hard to do in a pair, but it's a little bit less scary than if you're trying to say it out loud to everyone. So this is just not necessarily going through each question, but talking broad strokes. What are some messages, stories, or stereotypes about LGBTQ people? What are your experience with LGBTQ people growing up? Did you answer questions about lesbian, gay, and bisexual people differently from questions about transgender people? That's often a conversation, right? Is sometimes folks are comfortable with cis, lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks and are uncomfortable with transgender, or vice versa, interestingly enough, right? And then what, if anything, makes you uncomfortable about interacting with LGBTQ people? And sometimes I've had a lot of folks say, you know, I've had a lot of, for example, heterosexual cisgender men who they're like, lesbians are great, bisexual women are cool, gay men freak me out because I think they are hitting on me, right? Then you can have that conversation about what would be so bad if they did, and they probably aren't, right? So there's some good questions in here. This obviously really depends on how talkative your group is, right? You may have some groups that are willing to engage in the conversation and dialogue, and you may have some that are not as open to. But again, I think the pair and share at least gets them talking to each other, and hopefully you can share out with the big group, right? And then you had a great graphic and discussion about intent versus impact. So I just added to your words a little bit in the facilitator guide, and then gave some examples of some very simple allyship behavior, right? Listening to someone, believing people when they tell us who they are and respecting their identities, affirming people, connecting them to resources and community, and speaking up and intervening, right? So when people say, well, what exactly are you asking for? This would be the starting place. This is like the bottom rung of this ladder, right? Now, I did include a little bit more about names and pronouns. This is something that you either, depending on your campus, feel like, yes, we do want to have this conversation, or maybe not. Some places I've been to, names and pronouns are pretty easy. People are pretty good. They get it. They don't need this conversation. Other places, people are nervous about putting their pronouns on their Zoom bio or on their email, so they want to talk about it. So this is an area where I added it because I wasn't sure where Mount Union was, but just put some statistics in particular in here around why it's so important. So these are a couple examples of research done on consistently using the chosen name of a transgender young person, and then consistently using a transgender person's pronouns, right? So this is data that comes from Stephen Russell and then the Trevor Project. And then your wonderful case studies, and I'll show you those in a minute, but you all had already taken some great case studies from Jenny Beeman. I updated some of those just to bring them into sort of a little bit more modern context and tweaked a couple, but they're already pretty good, and you're already having some pretty good conversations there, right? And so the other piece I added in here is also just to note around expectations and boundaries. I think this is important for allies, in particular, your wonderful faculty and staff and students who sometimes like to go beyond what their role is on campus. I know, I saw Sarah smile there. If you've worked with student staff, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? So how can you be supportive while keeping appropriate boundaries? And the biggest takeaway here is the example of, if I'm not a counselor for that student, then I shouldn't be acting as a counselor in this role. My role as an ally is to get them to an affirming counselor who then can assist them with whatever mental health needs they may or emotional support they may need, right? That's the most extreme example, but I'm sure you all can think of many more that you could give them, right? Part of this is also trying to assuage the fears that sometimes faculty and staff have of, well, you're asking me to be an ally. Does this mean I'm going to have hundreds of students coming to my door and I have to be their counselor? That's not what we're asking you to do, right? We're asking you to be a safe space. We're asking you to interrupt homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, and we're asking you to be a conduit to affirming resources, right? I stole this image from social media. You do not have to keep it. It was your LGBTQ group's image that they had up at one point. But these are some of the resources I could find when I searched your website. So if I was a gay or transgender student, whoops, these are the things I would see if I searched your website. This is the slide you all need to update the most for it to be really impactful. And you may need more than one, right? But basically it's helpful to lay out for folks what is available on campus, right? And so I see already in the chat here, patients added add gem. Yep. Absolutely. And you also may decide that you want to add a slide not only about what's on campus, but you may want to do another slide about what's in the community, depending on your relationship to LGBTQ resources outside of the campus direct community. Right? Any questions, comments, thoughts so far from folks? Thank you, Jess, for the 2 thumbs up. All right. So then I did create, I didn't see in the Dropbox an actual ally agreement. I don't know if you had one before or not. So I drafted one for you. Again, I would highly recommend you all make it personal for what you want to see on campus. These are just some of the basic stuff, right? And I know this sounds a little ridiculous for some of these, but I have seen it happen on campuses where people sign up to be allies with the idea of, if I could just give them a little bit of information on how not to be gay, then that's the best form of allyship. So part of this is also getting them to agree to not do that, right? It also gives you the ability to, in a way, hold people accountable, right? And say, this is what we're asking folks to do, right? And if someone were to step outside, in theory, you could then say, hey, you've stepped outside our bounds. We want our sticker back. We're going to take you off the list if there's a public listing, et cetera. I say in theory because oftentimes on campus, these are things that are signed in the moment and not always followed up on because people get busy, right? But it does give you that ability to be transparent with what you're expecting people to do if they sign up to get sort of on this list of allies, right? And I'll show you what this looks like here when we're finished with the slides. Any questions, thoughts on this piece?
So Ted, do you ever see in presentations like this where people don't sign the agreement because they don't feel like they can do all of those things?
Absolutely.
Like I could maybe interrupt homophobia, but I don't know how I would do the others or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had, what also helps here is that it makes the tier 2 allyship program piece a little bit easier to mandate if you choose, because then you're not saying you have to be an ally. You're saying you have to get the information and then you make the decision about whether or not you're ready for this.
Right. Yeah, I think that would be an important conversation to have with like student staff, for example. We're going to probably require them to go through it, but I don't want them to just sign the agreement if they can't, own these things, if they can't agree to whatever the agreement ends up being.
And sometimes people will have folks sign the agreement in the moment. Some places actually have them sign it as an after the fact, so that there's not the pressure of everyone's turning it in and you didn't turn it in, so you're not an ally, so you hate me because I'm gay. It's like, no, that's not what this means. And you have to be very clear that signing this, or excuse me, not signing this doesn't mean that you're a hater, doesn't mean that you're anti-LGBTQ. It means you're not ready to sign up for an ally, because there is behavior that we're going to ask of you if you're going to sign up for this program. And if you choose not to, that's okay. You've still gotten the information, and you still could come back and say, I want to be an ally later.
Yeah, I think it would be important to assess sort of the readiness for this,
Mhm.
especially from students. Well, maybe not, maybe from everybody.
I mean, I've had offices where all the office is required to go through the training, and 1 or 2 staff members just isn't quite ready to sign on to this for any number of different reasons. Sometimes, you know, religion or faith. Sometimes they are a part of the community and haven't worked out their own stuff yet. And sometimes they're just, I had one professor that says, listen, I'm going to help as much as I can, but I'm overwhelmed right now and I'm on tenure. Once I get tenure, I'm going to come back for that sticker, but I can't sign this right now because I don't have time to do what you're asking of me. It's like, that's totally fair. Right? Any other questions, thoughts from folks? Thanks for that, Sarah.
Can I add one thing before we move in?
Yeah, of course.
Sometimes, whether you know it or not, when you offer these programs, somebody in a supervisor or managerial role will have alluded to or made it mandatory. So this, you may not even know that people are in the room who have no interest in being in the room as a facilitator. So this also gives them a completely okay out to not have to sign it without having to like come out as, I didn't even want to go to this training in the first place. So that's also a useful thing.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jess. All right. So the last piece is actually, you had already included this. Oh, Sarah's like, no, no, no.
We did, but this is my least favorite slide to talk about because it's overwhelmed me, but go ahead, you talk about it.
Well, with that in mind, I added a slide to try to bring it home, talking about terms related to the LGBTQ community. And really, for tier 2, this is just a teaser for tier 3, right? So basically, it's like, we've talked about this green level of individual responsibility. We haven't really talked about institutional change yet or around cultural change yet. So we've asked you to be an ally in this green space. Come back for 3, and we're going to give you tools to try to interrupt blue and red. There is a lot more notes. I'll show you when I show you the facilitator guide. There's a lot more notes on this section for how you could talk about it, right? And you'll see in tier 3 some examples, but I will say that this is also something where the goal here was to try to get them on the hook to want to come back for 3, right? But if you're running out of time, if this is being mandated, et cetera, this also may be something where it's like, hey, the goal is to get really through the case studies and the ally agreement, right? Those are the pieces that you want them to really be able to have time on, not necessarily, you know, teasing them for part 3. Oh yeah, I was like, I thought I had a arrow. I did. It says we're here. This is where we are. And so then it just, again, wraps up. We now are in the ally section. It goes over, you know, tier 1, this is what we covered. Tier 2, here's what we covered, right? And then 3, we're going to talk about skills, about making a community more equitable for everyone. Okay. And I will show you the facilitator guide for 2. And so again, very similar to tier 1, has all of the talking points that you might want to add. Obviously, it goes into some more details, right? So here are, for example, the debrief questions from the parent chair. Any aha moments, anything surprise you or stick out for you? Why do you think it's important to assess our own bias and allyship work, et cetera? Some examples of intent versus impact. More details on names and pronouns. And then your case studies here, these are just the comments on them. I'll show you the case studies in a moment on setting boundaries. And then I highlighted in pink the affirming resources that you all, like adding GEM and others here so that you would know where to add that. And then here's where it goes into a couple more details on that piece and what we do next. And case studies. All right, so case studies, again, you kept some of the ones that you already had here and adapted a couple of the other ones, right? So I did not break these down on how difficult they were, right? I just sort of picked 5 I think are the best examples. I also took out the case study examples that talked about policy changes on your campus because the hope was to move that conversation really into tier 3. And it's kind of hard sometimes to ask a student how they would change the registrar's policy in a case study scenario, right? It would be, I think this is more about trying to interrupt what can I do on the individual level, right? So there's an example of joking around and making fun of an openly gay student, misgendering someone who's a part of your staff team, concerns over someone using the wrong bathroom, someone who's come out, how would you support someone who's come out, and then hate crime that's happened on campus. And a student comes to you. Right?
And I think, Ted, that we had, and I don't remember the specifics now, but I feel like at one point we were trying to develop separate case studies if we had an all faculty staff group versus a student group. Although then I think we sort of abandoned that approach. So we've been both directions on that. But I feel like sometimes they were like, this is one's good for students and this one might be better for faculty staff to give scenarios that they would more likely encounter in their roles. But maybe that's not necessary.
These are written in a way that they could be used by students, faculty, or staff, but that
Right.
also means that they're written in a way that is kind of takes the person, right? Like Lucy, a student at your college, instead of Lucy, the person that lives next door to you in your residence hall, or the student in your class, or the student on your team, right? So I think there are ways to tweak these a little bit to make them more faculty, staff, or student friendly. Because in doing it this way and making it universal, they lose a little bit of that impact and trying to make them available to anyone. It also, particularly with the second one, works good if they are, a student staff member. If they're a student that's not a part of a staff team, that's not going to resonate as well. But you can easily tweak that to be on your athletic team, in your class, etc. Any other questions, comments, thoughts on case study stuff? All right. And then,
Ted, I had a quick question.
oh yes.
So the parent share and then also the case studies at the end. I mean, I know sometimes for me, these are difficult. What about we have, LGBTQ students in the training or faculty or staff or whomever it may be? This could also be really, you don't expect it to get to you, but it does. Like it affects you in a lot of ways. These are all issues that we've dealt with. So what's your recommendation there? How do we offer support during the training at the time?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there's, in my opinion, there's a couple ways to do this. So first and foremost, even as a facilitator, this can get to you, right? So like, I do this all the time. And never forget, I was in front of a large group of principals in Virginia, and I was talking about suicide statistics, and all of a sudden, a former student's face just flashed in my brain, and I He's like, I'm going to start crying on stage in front of all of these people, and I'm supposed to talk about this for the next hour, right? What helped is that I also had people that I could immediately text or call to say, I just need a minute, can you talk to me, right? So part of this is you all as facilitators creating your own little cohort of people that you trust that you can call on when that stuff happens, if it happens to you, right? Sometimes it's also helpful to just call someone and be like, you know, Jess, you're never going to believe what this student said in the training. I need to process this because I'm pissed or I'm excited or whatever, right? Jess and I do those calls often, so highly recommend that. So that's one. The second piece is that I think it is always helpful to have two facilitators who can be there the whole time where possible, so that you have someone who is actively facilitating the part and someone who is monitoring the room, can check with someone if they stepped outside, etc. Some of the ground rules talk about if you need a moment to step outside, please do so, right? I think that what's hard is that you want someone who's having a moment, whether they're part of the community or an ally or their friend or mom or cousin is a part of the community, to be able to process what's happening, but you don't want that to distract from the rest of the conversation in the room, right? And so how do we get that person what they need in the moment, right? Would be that, again, other facilitator asking, hey, let's step outside for a second. Can you tell me what's going on? What do you need? Do you feel like you want to continue in this conversation, or would you like to stay outside, right? And in particular with students, it tends to be more, in my experience, emotional. With faculty and staff, in my experience, it tends to be more that they want to talk about something that happened and they want to make sure that what they did was the right thing to do, right? And so particularly when you get to case studies, they're gonna sometimes want to ask more questions about a case that hasn't come up. And sometimes you want to take the dovetail and go down that road with them because it's an important conversation. And sometimes you say, hey, that's not what we're going to talk about today, but why don't we follow up afterwards, right? So I think that I didn't include as much content warnings in tier 2 that I did in tier 1, but we can certainly add more of those in. I think that also those sometimes help people know what they're going into. And I think it's helpful for, again, having two facilitators that can tag team when those things happen. Is that helpful a little bit?
Absolutely. And the ground rules part makes a lot of sense. And having a second person there that's able to interact with whomever may be feeling discomfort, like you said, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Yeah. I also will tell you, I have co-facilitated things before where I have turned to my co-facilitator and said, I can't do this next section because I'm having a moment. So I'm passing you the baton, friend. I'll be back, right? Because sometimes we also get triggered as facilitators. Somebody says something, somebody, does something, and we need to step out. Any other thought? I'm just bringing up the agreement now. So this is a fairly basic agreement. And again, I borrowed your logo here. It may not be to specs. By all means, please fix it because I know that can be, I'm only half joking. Trust me, as someone who once used the wrong color at a school of maroon, I totally understand that this is very important stuff. I accidentally used their peer institution competitors color. They were very upset, understandably so, right? Luckily, you all have purple, which is beautiful. So I loved doing all of this stuff for you. This is some basic stuff, right? I agree to listen without judgment. I agree to connect somebody to resources, not attempt to change someone's orientation or gender identity or expression, investigate my own bias, interrupt homophobia, biphobia, transphobia on campus, keep appropriate boundaries, and continue learning, right? And so I also added here, if you decided to go this route, that they would be, so there's sort of 3 things you're asking. Like 1, you agree to these bullet points, right? So that's the first thing they're signing to. The second is that they're checking, yes, I actually do want my name, email, and my role on campus to be publicly listed somewhere. This can be really helpful as people who are looking for support and coming to campus, because they want to know who in the communications department is a faculty member I could talk to about this independent study I want to do on the lives of transgender people, right? Or who is the athletic coach that I could talk to because I want to be a part of your athletic team, but I'm nervous because I'm a lesbian, right? And then the second piece is whether or not they would agree to display the placard or sticker that they've got in an appropriate place, and to not then pass that sticker or placard off to someone else who hasn't gone through the training, right? Now you all could decide, hey, we're not going to list people publicly, and or we're not going to give out placards and stickers. Again, I think these are helpful. One quick example I'll give you is this just happens to be an athletics example just for you, Kelly. I worked at an institution where they were trying to recruit a very top-notch basketball player to their program. And she was down to this school and one other school. And she told me when she came, she said, I want you to know the reason I came to this school and not the other one is because you all's athletic department had more ally stickers than any other program on the doors of the athletic directors and the doors of the coaches. So she literally counted the number of ally stickers she saw. And because she was an out lesbian, she was like, I don't want to go to a school and play on the team if I can't be myself. And that was what made her decision to go to our school over the other school. Now, it doesn't mean that those other school wasn't just as much an ally, but there was no way for her to ask that question without outing herself on the recruitment trip, which she wasn't quite ready to do because she just met these people on the recruitment trip, right? So that's just a small example of students in particular do look for this stuff because they're looking for visible support from their community. Right? Thoughts, question, comments from folks? Got a thumbs up from Patience. Thank you, Jess. All right. So let's look at tier 3.
Super excited. Never seen before, tier 3.
I know.
Right? It's just been like amorphous concept.
Right, and we have to do it at RA training, so I'm really excited.
Really excited.
All right, so tier 3 is all about advocates and accomplices, right? So similar startup. Now, again, if you're doing these back to back, obviously you don't do the ground rules every single time you start the next session, right? This just reviews the spectrum of support. Obviously we're talking about advocacy and what accomplices are. And we reintroduce Sarah's favorite part. Right? And so now we're going to talk about system level stuff. Right? Now, I put in 2 examples of how this can work. One is in the presentation where it would usually fit. One is at the end because you can swap them. You can also create your own examples depending on what you've got on campus, right? So the example I use is housing programs because you're doing it with RAs. Now, someone's going to say, I guarantee you one of your student staff is going to say, well, we've got gender inclusive housing options. Yes, you do. That doesn't negate the example I'm going to show you though, right? So I'm going to ask this one to Sarah. I'm going to pretend you're the participant. So Sarah, what are we afraid will happen if men and women share bedrooms on our college campus?
I don't know. Probably that they may have sex.
Yes, right?
Okay.
That's the big fear, that they're going to have sex. And we're also afraid, I mean, if we're getting real, there is a little bit of a fear that that sex may not be consensual sex, right?
Sure.
That's the fear, right? So if I'm creating a new university, I want to make sure that no roommates ever have sex. No roommates will ever have sex on my campus. So I put all of the men in the blue hall, all of the women in the pink hall, no roommates will ever have sex. Have I accomplished my goal on my new campus that no roommates will ever have sex?
That is false, Ted.
It's false. Very good. Thank you, Kelly. Right? So what's the problem with the policy? The problem is it assumes that all of the students are heterosexual and cisgender. It assumes that there's only 2 genders, right? There's only these 2 options. It does not mean, though, that the person that wrote this policy or enforces this policy hates gay people, right? They hate gay people so much that they're going to make sure that they have the option to have sex with their roommate. That doesn't make sense, right? We look for a villain in systemic oppression. We try to put the individual back into the field. They're not looking for an individual. The system is the villain, right? What it does mean is that it's rooted in the cultural ideology that everyone is heterosexual and cisgender and there are only two genders. It's that LGBTQ people weren't thought of when the program was created, when the policy was written, right? So when we're talking about this training in tier 3, this is about getting students and faculty staff in the mindset of how do we start changing systems, and then how we start impacting the culture around our campus and in our world around heterosexuality and people being cisgender, right? So how do we do that? These are just some basics, right? You want to ask yourself, like, whose identities were considered when this was developed? Whose were left out? What? This is the big one. What does the policy actually say? Because oftentimes you all know there's what's written, there's what's actually done in practice, and then there's the myth of the policy. There's what students say actually happens, right? When was the policy written and what was happening when it was written? If you know that information, it can be really helpful, right? Where does it live? Sometimes policies on campus are dictated by the department they're in. Sometimes they're dictated by the president's office. Sometimes they're dictated by federal law. Sometimes they're dictated by what Sarah thinks is best, right?
Often. Just
Right.
kidding.
The why is the policy written the way it is? What is it trying to ensure happens or does not happen? And what cultural norms does it uphold? And then how could it be more inclusive, right? So these are just getting them to, again, start thinking about this. And then there's an opportunity for them to brainstorm. Now, this is where for your student staff in particular, what we've created here is advocates and accomplices, right? That's the goal of this. And here we're giving them tools to start figuring out how do we change the system. Some campuses love this framework. They find it empowering for students and great. Some are like, no, we don't want students to be calling us to change policy. We just want them to be nicer to each other, right? Which is what we did in tier 2. Okay, so I'm giving you that caveat up front. The goal of this is to get people invested in trying to change the campus culture and policy to be more inclusive. So you start off with some brainstorms, right? Then we're going to take a step back and talk about just what is heterocentrism, that cultural ideology, right? This idea of coming out is the idea that somehow people were heterosexual and cisgender before, when really, if you're LGBTQ, you were always LGBTQ, whether you knew it for yourself or if you told anybody else, but you were assumed to be this default, right? So we need to figure out how do we start changing that. And so this is where you can start asking some more intentional questions about campus culture. So what campus institutions, celebrations, traditions, norms uphold heterocentrism and ciscentrism on campus? How can we start changing and challenging those? And what ways could we celebrate the LGBTQ community more, right? This is where you'll start to talk about stuff that's not just policy, but things on sort of what are the norms for your campus. And every campus is different. You all may have some of these already that you can think of, right? One campus I worked at, for example, it was tradition that all the first-year women wore a white dress to their first, what do they call it? The big speech that the faculty gives at the beginning of the school year. I can't remember what it's called. It has like a very fancy name.
Matriculation.
Yes, we're gonna go with that. The
Okay.
big matriculation.
Convocation.
Convocation, that's the word I was looking for. But I think matriculation might actually be the thing that they're doing.
Our-
at convocation.
Ours is called matriculation convocation, so.
There you go.
go.
So one campus I work, now this was not a written policy anywhere on campus. This was not something that was, no RA said you have to go back and put on a white dress. Everyone just wore a white dress because it was the rumor mill that this is what you do if you want to be a woman at this institution, right? This is a co-ed institution in the 2015s, okay? So you all may have some examples already. It would be helpful if you've got some of those to be thinking about those. Oh, sorry. I was looking at the chat because I saw the chat pop up and it was just someone was getting attacked by the mail. We're glad you're back, Jess. Okay. Any questions or thoughts on this little discussion that you would do in part of tier 3 before we get to the big bulk of this, which is the action planning?
I'm curious to hear what our students would say. Like, I would love to hear the answers to these questions right now.
Would it be appropriate to talk about cultural norms and changes that we've already implemented? So I'm trying to think about like, was it prom king and queen that we've changed, and best man and woman for the senior class? We've changed those, some of those. So
Correct.
that could be something that we can include in this right here too as well, right?
Absolutely. That's a beautiful example. That's a beautiful example, right? And even with stuff that you've already changed, sometimes some of your particularly upper class students, if they have been on campus before the change had come into full fruition, may not even know the changes happened. And so they may even give you the example, oh yeah, we've got the best man and best woman. And you can say, ah, no, we don't. So it's a chance sometime to talk about the progress that you've made. But that's a great example to put in here. And I think when you do this with your RA staff, this is also where you can start thinking about, are the questions written in a way that the participants can understand? Is there a way for us to tweak the questions? Did you word it differently when you asked them that then got better responses, right? Some of this is going to be a little bit of trial and error to get to a rhythm that feels good. And obviously, as facilitators, you all have your own style, so you may ask the questions differently already. That's fine. This is just trying to give you a framework. Any other thoughts on this section before we jump into the action plan part? Okay. So the rest of this really focuses on an action planning guide, which I have used on lots of different campuses, and so I'm inserting it here. And it starts off with, I'll show you that whole guide in a moment, but what changes people want to see on campus, right? And they answer a bunch of questions on what they want to see. And then they get a chance to do a pair and share. And it's a little more structured than the ones before, where you have one person share their idea. And it says 3 minutes. You don't actually have to give someone 3 minutes, right? You can kind of judge the room. But the idea is that you give one person a chance to talk and just completely share. And then you have someone who can give them feedback back, right? So it's not a conversation. It's more of a small mini presentation and feedback session, right? What's the problem you want to tackle on campus, right? And then these are the sections of the planning guide. Now, the goal of this is not to go through all of the planning, all of the action plan tools with them, but it's to introduce this tool for them to then take and use on their own. The tool that we're introducing here doesn't just have to be used for LGBTQ allyship. This could be around any type of change they would want to see on campus. And there are examples of what this looks like, right? And again, I'll show you the guide in a minute. This is just a reminder about, LGBTQ people are more than just one thing. So you need to be taking an intersectional approach to the work. And you'll notice here, I've added in some other examples of that system level, right? Or that blue or red level. And then you close out. There's not a lot of slides in this one because most of this is supposed to be discussion and work together, right? So let me show you then the guide, because that'll give you a better picture of what this looks like.
Ted, this is super minor, but on your last slide where you have the 3 tiers, says remember you're going to come back for this. Advocates and accomplices are on 2 different squares. Can they be on the same square because it's only 3 tiers? That's
yeah.
Stupid. And I don't know why that bothers me, but it did.
Yeah. And if it bothers you, it's not minor. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah,
That's-
also, I'm gonna duck out in a minute, so it's not because I'm offended or I don't like anything, it's just because I have another meeting. So I'll just say bye to everybody now and I'll duck out in a minute.
Okay. So this is an action planning guide I developed in part when I was working at Campus Pride, and have then further developed after I left Campus Pride. So I did give them some credit in here. But you'll see some, these are the basic questions, right? Like, what positive change do I hope to see on campus? What are possible ways you could see that positive change happen? Who would it benefit? What resources might you need? What barriers might there be? Is your plan focused on changing policy, creating a new resource, hosting a specific event, et cetera, right? And then they get into some of the actual tools. So this is an example of, power mapping, where they would put the most influential and successful people up in this tier, most influential but least supportive here, least influential, et cetera, right? And the goal here with with the power mapping, and again, you're not going into details over all of this, right? They're really focused more on answering that first page in tier 3 and getting familiar with the guide so that they have a chance to then do it on their own after the fact, right? Part 3 is about finding allies, right? So who can you count on for support? What organizations or offices are already supportive of your goal? Who are the neutral policies, and who's your opposition, right? And then there's a coalition building. And here I actually do put in a full example of a college campus that brought an LGBTQ group and a Latinx group together, talking about shared emotional connections and then shared issues, right? And the facilitator guide details more information than you're seeing here, obviously, right? And then your messaging, your elevator pitch. So what do you want to see changed? And how can you convey that to others in a short way, ideally 90 seconds, that will get them excited and on board? And then they have their timeline of responsibilities. And lastly, a SWOT analysis of what they want to do. Okay. And the facilitator guide here, oops, that's tier 2. So many boxes to open on a computer screen. All right, so the facilitator guide goes into a lot more detail on the different pieces of the tool here and how you would use them, right? As well as some more questions to ask in some of the cultural norms discussion. One thing I neglected to mention before is I do recommend, if possible, to use flip chart paper, or at the very least, if you're using a blackboard or whiteboard, take a picture of it, because you all will start to develop a list of, particularly when you're working with students, what their main pain points are on campus, right? So if you do this training 10 times in a year, and every single one of those trainings, a student brought up a particular policy that is causing a lot of harm to LGBTQ people, then as a committee, you've got an idea of where students might want to see the most change happen, right? Same for faculty or staff. All right. Bye, Sarah. We just missed her. So that is tier 3. Thoughts?
I like it.
So tier 3 is a lot more about individual work or small group work with the students or faculty staff you're working with. So there's a lot more of the facilitation happens there on a not in front of the big room talking about concepts. You're letting people start to do the work and then working either individually or in small groups to try to get them to utilize the tools you're giving them to try to accomplish the change they want to see. Other thoughts from folks?
Now we just have to do it
Right,
correctly,
I'm gonna send out the dates here shortly.
not screw it up.
If it's helpful to throw in the facilitation guide, like, I don't know, Ted, if you want to pull one up just to kind of review the structure. So Ted's kind of peppered in the bonus of having more than one facilitator, and y'all, at least the videos we've seen, you've always had 2 facilitators. But specifically for 3, because there's so much conversation and interaction with the participants, and you have a captive audience of RAs, I would highly encourage all of you to take on a facilitation role in number 3, because you're going to be in the room, you're going to be listening in a facilitator hat mode instead of a lurking in the corner watching mode. It's just a different way of watching what's happening in the room. But then you can also take in those facilitation guides, it's like minute by minute places that this is the kind of energy that should be in the room. This is the kind of conversations that should be coming up in the room. And then to actually make your facilitation guides even more personalized, after you do this a couple of times, like Ted said, you will eventually get patterns of what is coming up. And then you can add those in and be like, be prepared for these typical kinds of answers. So then you're like, oh, okay, great. So even your like AWOL to all the way full circle, carrying watermelon into the room. The other quote is, I didn't have anything else to do on a Saturday. Breakfast Club, anyone? Right? So there is always going to be somebody in these sessions that's like, what are you doing here? I didn't have anything else to do on a Saturday. So even their comments will eventually fit into a pattern, and you can kind of flush out those facilitation guides. But the facilitation guides are written so clearly, and Ted has done such an amazing job, which is why I handed this over to him, because this would not have been as good a job with me. It might have been funnier, but it wouldn't be thorough. But what Ted's facilitation guides do is that it actually enables even undergraduate students or peer education programs or something like that to be able to learn how to facilitate these things, support each other as co-facilitators through that structure in that guide. So this is kind of just the beginning piece of it, but it certainly accomplishes the goals that y'all kind of word cloud articulated you wished that a 3-tier program would do. So Ted, high five.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, the easiest way to do this is to actually take the action planning guide yourself and be a participant by yourself before you facilitate it, right? And I think part of this is, so I use this exact guide to get the Commonwealth of Virginia to pass transgender inclusive policies for K-12 schools. So me and my team sat down and we did a power map of every single elected official, where they are. We did a list of allies and opposition. We went through talking points and what we were going to say, right? Like the tools that are using here that are outlined by Campus Pride are also used by national organizing organizations to actually make change on a local, national, international level, right? These are old school organizing techniques. All I've done is put them together in the action plan. So the reason I say that is that you all have an opportunity to give your students in particular, but also your faculty and staff, some of these tools to then make the change they want to see. Now, the difficult part for some of your administration is then they're going to be able to make the change they want to see. So you got to be ready for that, right? You also may have to be prepared for, as Jess said, writing some of those notes down for what comes up repeatedly. And as you start talking about things like power mapping, right? It's usually when someone says, oh, do you all know Ted Lewis? Oh, horrible, worst person on campus. I can't believe they're still employed here, right? And you're like, I know Ted, they're not horrible. What are they talking about, right? So you get to have real hard conversations sometimes, unfortunately, about some of your colleagues that your students may know in a different way than you know them. So that's the other warning I always give folks, is that if you ask students in particular what change they want to see, they will tell you, and you have to be prepared for that answer to be one you may not like. I won that for you in particular, Kelly, because I had one school that said, we know how we want to create an LGBT center. We're going to get rid of all athletics because those are useless and pointless. And I was like, that is not a true statement at all.
No, no, no.
That was one where the other facilitator I was working with, she looked at me and said, you've got this, right? Because I need to step outside. And I said, yes, please step outside. And she did, because she used to be a softball player.
Okay. Yes, I would have been taking a minute.
Right, exactly. And we could talk about that. Why do you feel that way? And, oh, you had one bad experience at a party at a sport team. Great. That doesn't mean we get rid of this whole program. Any other questions, comments, thoughts from y'all about the GSA Q&A stuff?
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank
Sure.
you. Because I think we've sat around trying to figure out how to make level 3 work for like a year now. And you just kind of did it. 2, yes, 2, just 3, maybe 3. All right, a long time.
Well, listen, March 2020 to March 2021 doesn't really count as a year. It was, COVID, so I'll go with the 1 year. Again, the good news is you all have a lot of the, for tier 1 and tier 2 in particular, all I did was drop it into PowerPoint and flush out a couple pieces. The content was there. And the delivery videos that we saw was good. Students were engaged, they asked good questions, they had good comments. So, give yourself some credit. There was a lot there. And all you're doing now is just taking it to the next level and getting them ready to go out into the world and make some great change. You hope. So then what I'll do is upload all of these into Dropbox, and I'll email out a single link you can click on, and then you can open each of the folders for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. In there, you'll see a PDF copy and a PowerPoint copy of each of the presentations, the facilitator guides, as well as any handouts, pre-work, post-work, etc. I didn't show it to you here, but I did take your ground rules and tweaked them a little bit. They were pretty on point already. And then updated the implicit bias. I added a couple of questions in particular, because again, in my experience doing this, usually less with students and more so with faculty and staff, they often have experience with students who are cisgender and lesbian, gay, and bisexual. They know that, they've seen that. Transgender students and non-binary students, for some faculty and staff, scares the bejesus out of them, and they just don't know what to do, and they're really afraid of messing up. So their bias is that they just don't know enough yet to be the allies that they probably are ready to be if they would get out of their own way, to be quite honest with you. All right, so Jess, anything else from you? No, thumbs down. Any other updates from y'all about stuff you've been working on or stuff going on campus?
We were just waiting for this meeting.
Okay, I will ask an elephant in the room question if that's okay.
Of course.
So it's July 7th, which to Sarah feels like the summer is over because professional development starts on the 15th. So I'm just curious, how did or is or will the little group that's going to look at the Campus Pride Index stuff and update it, work on policies, how is that coming along?
But I actually met with Sarah before this meeting. And there's an email, or there's, don't get too excited.
I can't help it, you get me excited.
We have the list, and there's an email that was started, and we were going to kind of finish it and then pick a point person. for it. So her and I just tried to pick a date to kind of look over that email and see if we can finish writing it to send to the people that we picked
Sweet.
in those areas.
That's awesome. So just to be clear, and so it's part of the recording. So as the contract goes through your RA training and whatever else help or assistance that you need, I will answer any emails or anything that happens as that group is forming. If you want like a pep talk when the group first kind of gets together, and I can explain the incredible importance of it is either a hell yes or it is a no. It can be all kinds of shades of no, but it can only be a hell yes if you mark yes. I'm happy to kind of do that to get the group going, to hopefully maybe deter soft no's becoming hell yeses. You'll get a more accurate read, which is helpful to build from, right? So, but I'm happy to do that. And then obviously, you know, after everything gets kind of wrapped up, if I can help in any way, just drop me an email. But I think that institutionalizing the redoing of that is actually going to help you be able to identify those policies, and then cleverly Ted built into the conversations a review of kind of what has happened, and then now what do we need to do. So then it's always having like whiskers to find out what policies need to be looked at or not looked at first. So that's kind of how my part kind of comes full circle as well.
No, I think it would be good to have you say, here's how it's going to work. Period.
I am practicing because I leave tomorrow for a conference where I am emceeing, and I have to dress like Elvis for the opening number. So I have been bedazzling and up to my elbows in puff paint all week. I'm a trained
That's not
professional.
a new thing for Jess.
It is actually new in the sense that I didn't know how much I remembered from the early 80s. But my friend Jill was like, I don't understand how you're just, and I'm like, no, you're doing it wrong. You have to blop and then put the rhinestone so that it blops all the way around the rhinestone, and then that freezes it to the fabric. She's like, how do you know this? And I was like, hello, suburban upper class Dallas, 80s, 90s. Like, how did you miss this? Anyway, she said she missed it because she had a sense of style. Rude. I'm not the only person on this call, I think, who has ever taken a t-shirt and put it through a ring with a bar in the middle, or advanced points, if you had a wood cut out of a coyote howling at the moon with 2 circles, and you put the t-shirt through and then back through to dangle down. Anyone? Patience, thank you for getting me. You're welcome. All right, high five, y'all. Great work.
Good work, Ted.
Good work to y'all. So we'll send you the stuff, and then at least on our end, if I don't hear from you, I will assume that you're running with it for the August training. And then we can, after that's done, if you want to reach out to us and let us know, hey, we want to do a debrief call. Here's what we're thinking. We can talk about that. Or you can write us and say, everything went great. We're good to go. We're fabulous and fantastic. That is also a good email to get. All right. If there's nothing else, we'll let you go early. Look at that.
Well, I'll get you, Ted, I'll get you this recording and you can email everything over together.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Bye, y'all. Happy
Bye,
July.
thank you.